don't hate the motherfucking white people. We hate the oppressor, whether he be white, black, brown, or yellow. We gonna fight racism, not with racism, but we gonna fight with solidarity. We said we're not gonna fight capitalism with black capitalism, but we going to fight it with socialism.
Name a more iconic juror than the United States government in assassination attempts. And if you can name one, name another more iconic than the US government in foreign coups. And after that, try beat the US government in installing puppet governments in Africa. I'll wait. Starting with number 5, we have Fred Hampton, the very youngest of our list. Having been depicted in 2 blockbuster movies, Fred Hampton has been brought further into public awareness. The trial of the Chicago 7 deals with the mistreatment of fellow Black Panther Bobby Seale by the US judicial system in a trial so meme-worthy that none of the convictions stuck. Judas and the Black Messiah, on the other hand, covers the far more insidious FBI infiltration of the Black Panthers through the Counterintelligence Project between 1956 and 1971, which was aimed at destroying subversive groups, which include feminist movements, anti-Vietnam War groups, and civil rights movements. Unfortunately, the Black Panthers fell into all 3 groups. The Illinois chapter was particularly noteworthy for Fred Hampton's creation of a non-aggression pact amongst Chicago's street gangs that would eventually morph into the Rainbow Coalition, a multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multi-political group which fought against poverty, corruption, racism, and terrible housing conditions. Given how abhorrent these ideas were to the US government, and the title of the video, it should be no surprise that they launched an assault against him. The police would conduct a raid on his home, firing somewhere in the range of 99 bullets against a house full of sleeping individuals. Fred Hampton had spent the day earlier teaching a course on political education. Before the next morning, the police would put 2 bullets in his head after having already shot him once in the shoulder.
Looks like he's gonna make it.
He's good and dead now.
An African Marxist-Leninist, 4th place's Thomas Sankara is described as Africa's Che Guevara, and has been hailed as a hero of Pan-Africanism amongst African radicals. He was an avowed Marxist revolutionary of extreme charisma and a firm believer in national self-reliance. His 4-year tenure as president of Burkina Faso is marked by both the repression of his political enemies and the suppression of teachers who spoke out against him. It was also marked by the advancement of women's rights, as he was the first African leader to appoint women to positions of power in his government. A lack of grandiose spending, as he earned a public salary of $462 US in today's money, a reduction in Burkina Faso's mortality rate, and large-scale infrastructure projects. All the hallmarks of an existential threat for the American government. I will emphasize now that the French government has refused to release any documents from the office of François Mitterrand, the then French president, and the CIA has followed suit. As it stands, the likely motives for CIA involvement in his assassination are as follows. Firstly, rejecting IMF influence and encouraging other African nations to collectively refuse to pay their debts. Secondly, his staunch anti-France sentiment placing him in opposition of a NATO ally. Thirdly, styling himself after Che Guevara. The most critical pieces of evidence to CIA involvement are Charles Taylor, a war criminal that initially claimed the CIA aided his escape from Plymouth Correctional Facility, and the Italian documentary Ombre Africano by Silvestro Montanaro, translated to African Shadows, which includes the testimony from the wife of Charles Taylor. By her testimony, both Libya and France were knowingly complicit in the assassination of Thomas Sankara, and Charles Taylor helped facilitate this relationship. Once more, this is circumstantial, and the truth will never be known until CIA and French documents are released. Without them, we cannot know if they merely ignored a known threat to his life or directly aided in his assassination. Until then, what we know with certainty is that Thomas Sankara's replacement, Blaise Compaoré, overturned all of his policies, aligned Burkina Faso with the IMF and France, and would rule as a despot for the next 27 years. In 2022, the trial for Sankara's justice is ongoing. Blaise Compaoré is being tried in absentia. Having made the comparison to Che Guevara, We now have him in third place. The ultimate figure of counterculture, Che Guevara, was a Marxist guerrilla leader who took part in the Cuban Revolution. Arguably his first great crime in the eyes of the American government was taking part in overthrowing the US-backed Fulgencio Batista during the Cuban Revolution. The architect of the Soviet-Cuban relationship, Che Guevara very likely would have plunged the world into nuclear war had he been given control of the ballistic missiles during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the aftermath, he would denounce both the US and Soviet Union as using Cuba as a pawn in their politics. Continuing his revolutionary ideals, he would continue to export the revolution to Africa, attempting to train a group of insurgents against Mobutu Sese Seko in the Congo. His story would come to an end after his final failed revolution in Bolivia, where his guerrilla army would be defeated by CIA-backed forces. He would be executed on 9 October 1967. It would take 9 bullets, the final one to his chest, before he died. It is said he did not cry out in pain.
Somebody told a lie one day. They couched it in language. They made everything black, ugly, and evil. Look in your dictionary and see the synonyms of the word black. It's always something degrading and low and sinister. Look at the word white. It's always something pure.
Continuing the United States' history of interfering and sabotaging subversive movements within their own country, we have Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Officially, Martin Luther King was killed by James Earl Ray on April 4th, 1968. Officially, the US government had no involvement in this. Whilst his death hasn't been officially acknowledged by the US government as an intentional assassination attempt, a jury in 1997 found King to be the victim of a conspiracy involving the Memphis police and federal agents. And given the immense scrutiny he was under, it is unlikely that the authorities were unaware of a plot against his life. Not satisfied with his physical death, the US government has systematically killed his legacy. Martin Luther King has been made a toothless moderate who advocates ignoring the reality of race, when in truth he was a left-wing radical who supported the redistribution of wealth and loathed the military-industrial complex. He was also staunchly against the Vietnam War, and if you remember anything about the counterintelligence project, he may as well have been a walking nuke as far as the US administration believed. He strongly viewed racism at the core of America as a nation and decried the idea of waiting for time to fix its ills. He articulated these words at Grosse Pointe in 1967. To pretend that Martin Luther King Jr. would first oppose a violent revolution before the causes of the revolution is to be complicit in the assassination of his character. Patrice Lumumba is revered as a hero of Pan-African ideals, and he opposed Belgian rule in the Congo. If you are paying attention, this is the second time I've mentioned the Congo, and for good reason. In the case of Patrice Lumumba, the US and Belgian governments got up to some shady activities in the Congo. Not so strange for Belgium, who were the colonial overlords, and certainly another pattern of foreign interference from the US government. The context is as follows. The January riots of 1959 in Leopoldville forced Belgium to retreat from the capital, and by the 30th of June 1960, Joseph Kasavubu and Patrice Lumumba were installed as president and prime minister respectively. In the midst of this, Moise Tshombe, a then military commander, seceded with the Congo's richest province of Katanga. It was through Katanga that Belgian forces would flood into the Congo in an attempt to take back their former colony. For the next few months, all pleas to the UN and the US would fall on deaf ears, and upon requesting aid from the Soviet Union, quote, Lumumba fell out of favor with Washington, end quote. The US government would directly lend their support to Kasavubu, and by September 1960, they had co-opted Colonel Joseph Mobutu, who as a side note would go on to rule the Congo as an iron-fisted dictator. He was informed that the US diplomatic personnel in the Congo were at his absolute disposal. Note that this is the same Mobutu that Che Guevara fought against. Lumumba would be forced to flee the capital in a convoy across the Congo. The CIA at this time were actively monitoring his movements, and the officer on the ground, Officer Hedgeman, was aware of Lumumba's likely return to power should he not be dealt with immediately. Quote, Station and embassy believe present government may fall within few days. Result would almost certainly be chaos and return to power. End quote. Lumumba and his two closest allies would be captured and arrested by the forces of Mobutu on December 1st, 1960. After 6 weeks of imprisonment, starvation, and torture, Patrice Lumumba would be executed by firing squads on January 17, 1961. The official stance remains that the US had no direct involvement in the killing of Patrice Lumumba, despite being aware of his movements and the threat he faced. This is despite President Eisenhower saying that Lumumba should be eliminated. Compare this to Belgium, who have apologized for their role in the killing of Patrice Lumumba by moving him to territory controlled by his enemies, and later dissolving his corpse in acid. Belgium still holds Patrice Lumumba's final remains. If you've been listening, there is a bias to this. There is a specific agenda. It's a rather obvious one. I haven't tried to obfuscate it. The question is, does it really matter?